Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions during the presentation. If we are unable to answer them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Braden Knutson. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from John Hendrix, who will be giving a presentation titled U.S. Land Records. John has been married to his wife Susan for 39 years. They are the parents of two outstanding young men. They have lived on the East Coast, the Midwest, and the Southwest parts of the U.S. while pursuing his career. John is a certified public accountant by profession and has been the chief financial officer of a few large corporations, both public and private. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in accounting from Brigham Young University. He has one class remaining for receiving his certificate in family history research, which is approximately equivalent to a minor in the subject. John and Susan are now retired and live in Provo, Utah. John is a convert to the LDS Church and was baptized in California when he was 14 years old. He started to do genealogy when he was 16 and has been pursuing his family history on and off for decades. For the last 6 years, genealogy has been one of his main activities. John has been serving as a family history service missionary at the BYU Family History Library going on 4 years. He and his wife are currently the coordinators at the BYU Family History Library, where they manage the activities and training of over 130 missionaries.
Thanks, Braden, and welcome to my U.S. Land Records class. I have to admit, I gave Braden an old bio, and actually, Susan and I have been married for over 42 years, so I don't think she'd want me to put 39 years on there. This is the first time for me teaching without students in front of me, without the student interaction, so I hope you'll bear with me if it's just a little bit different, let's just say that. I hope the class will be of benefit to you in your search for your relatives. Land records can be a gold mine when trying to expand your understanding of your ancestors, and hopefully this class will give some of that to you. This is a basics class that is meant to give you an overview of land records in the United States. I won't be discussing individual states or counties' land practices in any detail. That being said, one of my objectives is to give you enough information so you can dig into the details and understand the evidence you will find. So let me see here, just a second, it's not turning. Let me go here. So I asked the question, why bother with land records? When you do a search on familysearch.org or ancestry.com, you'll typically see hints for census records. And sometimes you'll see hints for other records, including vital records such as birth, death, and marriage. In fact, I would always suggest trying to find your ancestors in census records first, since census records have so much information and connect generations together. Coupled with that, I'd probably go to vital records, obituaries, Social Security death index, gravestones and cemeteries, documented family histories, and other things. But in particularly documented family histories, and when you take classes in genealogy, you'll find that that's one of the things they teach you is to go to compiled sources, to go there first, and if they're documented, sometimes they can be extremely valuable. But land records, again, can be extremely valuable. But again, I would ask you, why bother with land records? And some of the answers are, the desire for land ownership was one of the most powerful forces driving U.S. immigration and settlement of the American frontier. Immigrants were lured to America by the opportunity to own land and improve their lives. The ownership of land in Europe was not universal, whereas in America, almost everyone eventually owned land. Americans were enticed to move even farther into the wilderness by the enticement of cheaper or free land. So it is likely that almost all of your free male ancestry that was in America for any length of time eventually owned some land. Land transactions were carefully recorded and preserved due to the importance of proving one's ownership of land. Even when a courthouse or other repository burned or was flooded, attempts were made to recreate records concerning property ownership due to their significance in people's everyday lives. So, again, land records can reveal connections between family members. They can provide names of spouses or previously unknown children. Land records can identify many or all of an individual's living heirs when they jointly sold inherited land. They can include information about a person's previous residence or location to which an individual moved. They can indicate when an individual likely moved into the area where he lived and how long he lived there. They can identify an individual's occupation. And they can specify whether an individual served in the military or was an immigrant. They can also, in the case of a grant for service in the military, the individual requesting the grant had to make a very extensive application that can reveal a lot of genealogical information. Basically, a grant for service, an heir or spouse or whatever requesting a grant had to prove that they were related to the person, so they had to send in documentation, marriage certificates, other documentation, sometimes attested to in court, to get the grant. In the case of inheritance, the deed will also give an extensive amount of genealogical information. In inheritance, administrators had to identify all the potential heirs, and therefore you can see generations with that type of record. Land records can reveal other family or close friend connections when investigating adjoining property. Prior to the early 1800s, land records are particularly important because land was always eventually recorded, and the ownership of land was so important, and so it was always recorded eventually. Vital records in the U.S., meaning birth, death, and marriage records, started in the late 1800s to early 1900s. California didn't start until after the 1900s. The colonies had, of course, some vital records recording prior to that time, but most other states in the United States didn't have vital records until late 1800s, and so land records can substitute for other documentation. And prior to 1850, of course, as you probably know, the U.S. Census records only listed the head of the household by name. So again, land records or court records of any type were very important records when other records were not available. So, first acquisition of land in North America was by foreign nations. Of course, the Spanish were the earliest explorers, and they had acquisitions in the southern and western part of the continent. The British colonies, of course, were, first were here with Jamestown and the Pilgrims, and they had claims on the colonies and also in the Pacific Northwest. Some of you may not know that the Dutch exploration, Henry Hudson, and he was looking for the passage through the Northwest Territory. He went up the Hudson looking for that passage. Of course, he didn't find it, but the Dutch then gave franchises to very wealthy Dutch individuals all up and down the Hudson River Valley, and the Dutch had quite an influence on that area because it was almost all Dutch. Of course, I'm sure most of you are aware, the Dutch, most people aren't aware of, but the French claims in the north of the United States and within the United States early on, and in the Florida region are well known. And of course, Mexican settlements and claims in Texas and along the Pacific coast, there were extremely large land grants to wealthy individuals that were given. And then, of course, the Russian settlement and claims in Alaska. Anyway, all of those original claims to land, many individuals have land deeds right now that go back to those original claims and grants that were given by foreign countries. And so you need to understand that even though it may seem like the foreign nations completely obliterate any of the land claims in America, lots of the claims actually go back to those original grants. Uh, Here's a map that kind of can explain some of that. If you look on the map up here in the north, that's the St. Lawrence River. All of this area that is goes around here, that's kind of in the golden or yellow color, is all the claim by the Dutch. The Hudson River goes straight down here. They had claims all the way down to Chesapeake Bay, all the way up to the St. Lawrence. What happened actually is they were here prior to the Pilgrims. Their first settlements were made in 1619, and the Pilgrims came in 1621. And the they owned all this land, and they were very prosperous. Manhattan, if you remember the stories about the Dutch getting Manhattan for some beads that they paid the Indians, is actually, it was more than that. But they they controlled all this land, and Manhattan became one of the world's greatest trading centers during the time, because they had all the trading with the Indians up and down the Hudson River, and it all comes to the Manhattan area and the New York, or New Netherlands at the time, and New Amsterdam. That's what New York was called. And so they became very wealthy. The Dutch were very inclusive. That's probably why New York is kind of crazy today, is because they were very inclusive. They had all different nationalities there, all different colors of people, Jews, any nationality. They were very accepting of all different types of people, and that's one reason why New York is very inclusive today as well. But in the 1670s, 1660s, 1670s, about 10 years, there was wars between the Dutch and the English. The Dutch actually had very large fleets of ships, and they had various wars and whatnot, but finally the English were able to take over Manhattan and took over the land. And basically, the victor, of course, writes the history, and so the Dutch history during that time is pretty much gone now. Um, but but that's the type of thing that happened that maybe you don't realize, but a lot of the land in that area goes back to the original Dutch grants and the original franchises that were given to wealthy Dutch individuals. And then you go to after the colonies, after the revolution and everything, and you have here, the 13 original colonies, and then the expansion from those colonies, and then the other purchases, the Louisiana Purchase and the Texas annexation and the ceding of Mexico, or the California and Nevada and Utah by Mexico in the mid-1800s. All of that, after the Revolutionary War, all of that was either acquired by purchase, wars, treaties, and other compromises. Acquiring all of this land resulted in a country with a very small population, with a lot of land that was sparsely populated. Of course, I don't really want to get into the Indian issues, but it was very sparsely populated until they started getting some of this land and people started going west. To get into this, though, we need to go over some terms, and I'm just going to give you a few terms on a couple of pages here, just so we're kind of on the same basis. Some basic terms are bounty land, and that was land awarded by a state or federal government to veterans or their heirs for military service. And when you ever have bounty land, lots of times you, particularly if an heir was claiming the bounty land, you can have an awful lot of genealogical information associated with the documentation with that bounty land. Dower right. A dower was a share of the land owned by a woman's husband during marriage that was designated for her support during widowhood. And when you had a dowry, if a man were to sell the land, if the woman didn't sign in releasing her dower right, the title was somewhat suspect, and so you always had to get that dower. The thing about the dower release is many times it would designate the maiden name, it would give her a given name, and so you can find out more information. Sometimes it's hard to get women's ancestry, and that's one way you can get it. A grant is a government authorized right of title to property previously owned by a government entity. So anytime the first deed comes from a government, it's called a grant or a patent, sometimes it's called as well. And then there's meets and bounds, and that's a survey method that's used by state land states, and originally all countries use meets and bounds. And describe land by measuring and naming boundary features. As I mentioned, a patent, well, it's actually the final documentation issued to a purchaser by a government for the purchase of property previously owned by government. And then a quick claims deed is a deed that will grant you the right to the property, but it's not a guarantee that the person that you're purchasing it from actually has the rights to grant you that. So it's basically they're saying, I no longer claim any right to this property and you have it. A warranty deed, on the other hand, is a type of deed where the grantor, the seller, guarantees that he or she owns clear title to a piece of real estate and has a right to sell it to the grantee or the buyer. There's a difference between a public land survey system and meets and bounds states. The states that are in white, let's see here just a second, if I can draw my arrow here. The states that are in white, this original 13 colonies plus 7 other states, including the state of Texas, were all state land states, and they owned the land and they used the meets and bounds system in terms of surveying. All of these other states in color are public land survey states, and they were land was granted to individuals out of these states from the federal government, and it was done by a public land survey system. And that system involved, in fact, it started in Ohio, where they first started surveying, and that was one of the first areas that was settled after the Revolutionary War. But to give you an example, they had a baseline and then a meridian, and everything within that area started from that baseline and meridian. For example, in Utah, the baseline and meridian is right at the southeast corner of the temple, Salt Lake Temple site. It's actually, there's a memorial right outside the current wall of the temple grounds, but if you go inside the temple, actually the point where it really starts is actually inside the temple, and they have a marker there as well. But as you can see my little arrow, that points to right to where the southeast corner of the temple is. For instance, down here in Arkansas, the baseline is down here in Arkansas. The meridian goes up here where my arrow is, but all of these other areas in green start at this baseline and meridian. So as you can see, the yellow is the baseline and meridian starts right here in, I believe it's Nebraska, and going forth. And that's where all of this land in yellow is surveyed from that baseline and meridian. Let's go on here. So on meets and bounds, however, the land system that began under the administration of foreign governments, the meets and bounds survey method consisted of 4 elements: physical markers such as trees, riverbanks, and rocks, measurements of distance such as chains and rods, and there are certain distances, directions, meaning compass bearings, degrees between 0 and 90, and there's 4 sets of degrees. And for instance, on this example, they're starting right here at the Great White Oak, right against the river. And so one says 46 degrees southwest, 50 chains, and changes the distance, and the degrees is the direction. And then 2 is 76 degrees southwest, 60 chains, which goes to this marked oak. The first one went to the felled maple, and so on. So, the problems with the system is, first of all, the irregular shapes for properties make for much more complex descriptions. And over time, these descriptions became problematic, as you can imagine, because the trees would die or the streams move because of erosion, or just various things would happen, and so it can cause a lot of disputation as well. And it really wasn't useful for the large, newly surveyed tracts of land being opened in the West, which were being sold sight unseen to investors. They had to have a much better system, which was the public land survey system. So the public land survey system, if you go to a baseline right here, if you look on this yellow block right here, this is the baseline. And if this were in Salt Lake, that baseline would be right on South Temple. And then the principal meridian in Salt Lake would be right at the southeast corner of the temple lot. And so that would be where everything starts for Utah, where everything is surveyed from. And you can go into Utah County, you can go to South Utah and everything starts in terms of the survey from that point. And the way it's talked about, if you go to this block right here, this would be Township 2 South, Range 3 West. And the way you figure this is the township is one township, and then the second township, so that's 2 South, and then the range is 1, 2, 3 West, and so that's how you would figure it. Then each of these townships are 36 square miles. And as you can see, this block here, it has 36 in it, and that's the township. And it starts with the first township within, or the first section within that township is number 1, and it goes left to number 6, and then it goes down to number 7. That's how they basically are numbered. So if you go to section 14, again, which is 1 square mile, if you look at section 14, this portion of section 14 then is called, if you have the total description, is Township 2 South, Range 3 West, section 14, northeast quarter of that. And so, and down here, you would have the north 1/2 southwest quarter. And so that's how it's basically described and how you would understand something. And when you get into these townships, basically, if you go, like I have ancestors in Missouri, I've got them in various places that are public land survey system. And one of my ancestors attained original title in various townships and sections and whatnot. And I can actually trace exactly where they are on the maps because they're, public land survey system is still in existence. And he had original patents on these grants, and his name is recorded in the government recording and everything else. And so it's very interesting, and I can see what he paid for it, if he paid for it, or what he didn't pay for it, if he got it for various reasons. And so so it's a very good thing. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was the beginning of the public land survey system, and the Continental Congress was deeply in debt following the Declaration of Independence with little power to tax. They decided to use the sale of the Western territories to pay off the Revolutionary War debt. And it's been modified by letters of instruction and manuals of instruction issued by the General Land Office and Bureau of Land Management, but it's basically the same as it always has been for a long, long time. Going on, within meets and bounds lands as well as public land survey lands, you can have subdivisions, which in subdivisions, it's typically used in cities and towns that have been surveyed. In order for plats to become legally valid, a local governing body, such as a Public Works Department, an Urban Planning Commission, or zoning board, must normally review and approve them. A plat map, as you can see right here, this is a plat map. It's an engineer's map showing the land use for the land in question, and it's within in the case of a public land survey system land, it'll actually give the distance from boundary lines and everything within the PLSS system. And but these areas are subdivided up and can be divided into blocks and lots. So typically your house will be a certain block and a lot within a certain subdivision, such as a legal description could be Happy Trail subdivision, block 3, lot 4. You can go to the county and you can find that plat that's been registered with the county, and you can see exactly where it is within a township and a range and everything else. Going on, first acquisition of land was, initial acquisition was through land grants by countries, as I mentioned before, England, Netherlands, Spain, France, and Mexico. Those land grants were given usually to very wealthy individuals, and they owned large parcels of land. Then there was other ways the land was granted, quick rents. Bounty land was given either through military service or other reasons. And bounty land, as I mentioned, can be very valuable for genealogical information. Head rights land was given to captains of ships, where they brought a certain number of people across to be almost like an indentured servant, and they would then, the captain would receive a certain amount of land, and the people who worked for him would actually receive a certain amount of land too. There was indentured servant land. Sometimes people would come across and they would serve so long and they would actually get land too. But the granddaddy of land within America, of course, was the Homestead Acts, and that granted land. There was multiple Homestead Acts. I have to go back and look, but there was probably 20 different Homestead Acts, and basically in a lot of cases it meant that you could get the land for a very small amount of money if you just lived on it and improved it, and then you would be granted the title to the land, and after a certain number of years. And then there was also pre-exemption acts, because there was a lot of people that went west before the public land survey system was in existence. They settled on land and they claimed certain land and everything. Pre-exemption acts allowed them to actually get a deed to the land because they were already living there, and basically the Congress wanted to be able to grant them a free and clear title to the land, and so the pre-exemption acts allowed that to happen for all the people who settled west before it was really a valid thing to do. So, availability of first acquisition of land, federal land patents are digitized and available on the Bureau of Land Management's website, and I'll give that later, but it's glorecords.blm.gov. This database, it serves as an index to individuals named in federal land patents and warrants created from 1788 to the 1960s. And the case files, which may include biographical information about the buyers, have not been digitized but may be obtained from the National Archives. I was in the National Archives just late last year, and I was able to get files that weren't digitized, and on some of my ancestry that was very good information. Sometimes it will just be very simple information. It'll be a receipt or what they paid or whatever, and then the patent itself, but sometimes there'll be a lot more detailed information. State land patents and foreign government land grants are typically found in state archives and state land offices. The Family History Library collection includes, at Salt Lake, includes copies of many colonial land records and indexes. And again, because the early ones, it was in state archives sometimes, and also in local archives. But on the Family History Library, use the place name search option of the catalog. Then you should select the state of interest and search for land and property. The typical process of acquiring land, like in the colonies, it was a four-step process. First, there was an application by an individual, and the individual was described, which is great too as well. You get genealogical information from that. It'll describe the conditions of the property, proof of vacancy, that type of thing. They had to submit various documents. They They can have been submitted with the application, and sometimes it was evidence of citizenship, military service, or prior claim to land. So that had really good information. The second step in the process was getting a warrant, and that authorized the potential buyer to get a surveyor to go out and survey the land and identify the specific piece of land and give it a specific identification so that the person could eventually buy the piece of land. Next was once they had the warrant, they could have the survey done, and under the meets and bounds system, that's what they would do. And the good thing about the surveys, though, it would show the adjoining properties and the ownership of the adjoining properties, which sometimes, lots of times, families move together and they bought land in the same areas, and so you can see some of the relatives close by or in-laws or that type of thing because they had land typically near each other. And then a patent would be issued, and that'd be the completion of the process, and the deed would be issued. Subsequent transfers of land. Land transactions were carefully recorded and preserved due to the importance of proving the ownership of land. Even when courthouses or other repositories burned or were flooded, and that happened quite often, especially during the Civil War, the raiders and whatnot, they would burn courthouses on a regular basis. Both the North and the South would do the same thing. But because land was extremely important and the title to the land was extremely important, they would recreate the records almost immediately, because to be able to sell, they had to have some record to prove that their ownership was valid. And so unlike other types of records that go way back, land records are almost always recreated, and almost without exception. Land and deed indexes were generally recorded and kept at the county courthouse, with the exception of several New England states where transactions were recorded at the town clerk's office. Many deeds are still kept at these locations in town clerk's office today. In other cases, deeds may be stored at another repository, such as the state land office or the state archives. Some states, such as Maryland, have created digitized copies of their deeds and made them available to researchers online. To research land records, I would always research the county your ancestor resided in at the following two websites before I tried to do any research. First of all, this may sound maybe not normal, but I'd go to Wikipedia to glean general information about the county that you're going to research in. Then secondarily, I would go to the Family Search wiki on familysearch.org and go to the county and then click on the land records and the courthouse articles. This will give you almost always where the information is going to be stored and where you need to look for the county land records. Office for land records are generally in county courthouses and are called the following: Recorder of Deeds, Register of Deeds, Register of Conveyances, etc. You will find all types of places where deeds are recorded and stored. Sometimes you'll find a law firm or a title company that will have the historical chain of ownership. You'll need to be able to find the county your ancestor resided in during the time he resided there. And of course, the boundaries of counties changed as the country was expanding. So the Family History Library has an extensive collection of microfilm deeds and deed indexes that represent most counties, but not all in the United States. You can locate these collections in the Family History Library catalog by using the place name search option, selecting the county of interest or town of interest for several New England states, and looking for land and property. But just remember, I've been to counties and I've found land information that was not at familysearch.org and has not been microfilmed and or digitized. And so sometimes you just have to go through the dusty old records and talk to the county people or the local person that is really the person that knows everything about the county. Subsequent land record recording process. So initial deed is called a patent or grant. Recording a land deed was not required and many times was not completed before a new transfer of land was made. Sometimes this could be even decades after the deed was executed because people didn't understand the importance, lots of people didn't understand the importance of recording a deed back then. And but today, of course, modern times, it's almost always recorded immediately. Of course, title insurance companies ensure that happens as they are liable if someone else records before them. When the process is actually, the deed is drawn up back in the time, and this is somewhat similar today. The deed is drawn up and the grantor usually signed it before at least 2 witnesses. If it was acknowledged in court, then the witnesses were not necessary. The deed then was presented in court before it was ordered recorded. And usually the wife relinquished her dower interest at this time. But sometimes the release wasn't done until decades later. And but you should always look for the release if you don't see it at the initial recording of the deed. But the great thing about the release too was you typically had the given name and the maiden name, as I mentioned before, of the spouse. If the deed was properly acknowledged or proved, the court then ordered it recorded, and the clerk made an entry to that effect in the court order book and or the court minute book. After the deed was ordered recorded, the original deed was left with the clerk for recording. And this was as he had time, the clerk transcribed the complete deed into a deed book. Therefore, the deed books in the courthouses are actually transcribed copies of the deeds that the clerk made, not the originals which were returned to the grantee. So there can be mistakes in the transaction too, and if you can find it, you should look for the original deed too as well, even though the deed should have been transacted completely by the recorder or the clerk. The clerk then made entries into the indexes, and so the indexes you can use to be able to find particular people because the indexes are usually alphabetical and under the name of the grantor and also under the name of the grantee. You can usually find both in the indexes. And after the deed was then transcribed into the record book, the clerk usually wrote the book and page number and the date of acknowledgement on the original deed. So if you find the original deed, sometimes you'll see that, and then you can trace that back to the index and the minutes or the recording that the clerk made. So strategies for using land records include all of the following. In terms of gleaning all possible clues from both transacting parties, deeds reveal important fact about the transacting parties, the seller and the buyer, the grantor and the grantee. So you should always make note of these clues. They may help you to separate individuals of the same name. They may help you to estimate when your ancestor was born or determine whether your female ancestor was married, single, or widowed at the time of the transaction. They can help you transact or trace an ancestor's migration. You should look for the grantor's wife name. The most significant property right of women was dower. And dower right was the share of the land owned by a woman's husband during marriage that was designated for her support during widowhood. And acting alone, men could not sell their property to deny their wives dower. Dower was necessary in a legal system that denied women the ability to provide for their own financial security during widowhood. Wives didn't have a lot of legal authorities in those days. Unless a wife consented to sell or mortgage the family land, the buyer's title was usually not secure. In many states, several years after a transaction occurred to which the wife was not a party, she could sue for her dower right and find support in a court of law. So even though you bought a piece of property, if you didn't have that dower release, the wife could come back and claim some of your property. Therefore, when a parcel of land was sold, most states required the wife to release her dower right before the sale could become final. And again, it record the wife's given name and potentially her maiden name. And then every person that was mentioned in connection with your ancestor, you should note. This includes named relatives as well as neighbors, witnesses. Many deeds state family relationships, sometimes 2 or more generations of relatives or heirs, so that can be extremely valuable. Having family relationships spelled out in deeds generally facilitates the process of organizing people into families, especially since so many deeds predate other records of genealogical value. You should carefully examine the property description. The property description in a deed is important to note. How many acres or lots was it? What was the physical description of the land? Was the land known by name? These bits of information can be extremely important to your research. You should note the transaction date and the recording date of each deed. A deed may not have been recorded for many years. Filing was not required at the time of the transaction. Search at least 20 years beyond the last known date of an ancestor's existence in an area to find all deeds that named your ancestor. By noticing the dates, you can sometimes identify when a person arrived and left an area. If your ancestor bought or was granted the same number of acres that he sold, he may have moved away from the locality. Note the payment or the money consideration. Was the purchase price of the land $1,000 or $1? Such clues could indicate a possible relationship. If a grantor deeded 100 acres of land to a grantee for an amount that is significantly lower than the going rate for 100 acres of land at the time, perhaps the father was selling land to one of his children for a fraction of its value. Many times, older parents would grant their land or sell their land to a child in return for perpetual care in perpetuity. This has happened many times, or they would sell the land right before they knew they were sick and they were going to die. And so therefore, many times their estate wouldn't go through probate. In fact, I would say that's most of the time. Most of my ancestors didn't go through probate and didn't have a will because they actually granted whatever estate they had, their land or their other assets, to their child for perpetual care, and therefore they didn't go through probate, so you won't see probate records, but you will see land records. So that's another reason why land records are extremely important. You should identify the boundary changes that may have affected your ancestors' land. County boundaries were consistently changing as new counties were created, and sometimes new states were created from other states or territories. So you've got to make sure that you're checking the right location for the time period you're researching. Going on, just to give you a couple of pages here of important online resources for land record research. As I mentioned, I would always read the general information about a county in Wikipedia. That's important that you understand something about the county. Then go to familysearch.org and read the wiki article on the county of interest, and particularly the land records in that county. And the Wikipedia article will always have a land record article. I just put in maps2.utahcountyonline.org because it's a good example of a county interactive map. It has an overlay with township and range and everything like that, and a lot of the land actually still in ownership, like in Utah County, for instance, is still described by ranges and counties and everything else. If you go to this particular website, you'll see that. FamilySearch.org, they probably have the largest land records in indexes in any one place, and it's a very good place to go first. But again, there is land that is not in FamilySearch.org, and you have to go to the counties. HistoryGeo.com can locate your first landowners. It's a really cool website. It does basically the same thing as the next website, but it does in a really nice manner. But the GLOrecords.blm.gov is basically going to give you your first landowner patents, and it'll actually have the original documents, the signatures of the people involved and everything else. And it's a very, very good place to go. All you have to do is type in your ancestor's name and for location, and you'll get all the people with that potential name, last name, and given names. Goldbug.com is AnyMap. AnyMap is well known amongst genealogists. It gives identifies county by year, so you can go to 1776 and you'll see just the colonies and a little bit more, and then you start going with later years and you'll start seeing where counties were formed, states were formed, and you'll see the different counties as they progress in the states, as they change the counties through the years. And the reason why that's important, again, is because you may know that your ancestor lived in, say, Cass County, Missouri, but Cass County, Missouri may have been a big area at one time, but then it was split up. And so the records of your ancestor's land in subsequent purchase or buying may be in a county that's not now called Cass County, Missouri. So you need to know the counties. And usually a good rule is just to search all the counties surrounding the county that you're looking for. Newberry.org does the same thing as AnyMap, the goldbug.com. It finds counties by year. DavidRamsey.com has an extensive map collection that can be very useful. The same thing with the University of Texas, has extensive map collection. Mapofus.org is interactive U.S. maps that show counties going year by year. It's not as useful in direct genealogy research, but it's quite interesting. The blm.gov, the next website, gives land descriptions, diagrams that I had in this PowerPoint documentation, and I think it can be very useful for understanding. And then the SMU website that lists there gives a lot of land measurement conversions, and it's a very good guide that it would be very useful in converting rods and other things to feet. So in conclusion, I hope that this has given you kind of a general overview of what you need to understand for land records. You, of course, need to dig into the details, and the details are always different, and that's why I wanted to give an overview so you can understand how land was acquired in the U.S. and how you can find your ancestors in old land records. But remember that land records can be extremely valuable in genealogical research. It can be a gold mine sometimes. And this is particularly true, again, for ancestors living prior to the 1850s. All court records are very valuable prior to the 1850s when you're researching back beyond there, because you don't have census records that are specific in connecting families. All you have is head of household on federal census records to 1790. So always learn as much as you can about the particular county prior to researching the records. You should remember that. And if you cannot find what you want in the Salt Lake City Family History Library, always consider researching the actual county, because there's many, many records out there that haven't been digitized or microfilmed. And with that, I appreciate your listening to this, and hopefully this has been of benefit to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, for the wonderful webinar. I certainly learned a lot. Just so everybody knows, this webinar will be posted online later this evening for review, and will be posted on YouTube within the coming days. If you go to the website at the bottom, our BYU Family History Library website, you'll be able to find our schedule for upcoming webinars and a complete list of all the past recordings. Thank you very much.